Okay, so let's talk about Halls of Valor. So, for those who don't know, Blizzard decided that Halls of Valor was going to be one of the legacy dungeons that they're bringing back in this expansion, with Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, Court of Stars, Temple of the Jade, and Temple of the Jade Serpent. Those dungeons are going to be standing alongside four Dragonflight dungeons as dungeons that are going to be returning in the expansion. So, whenever Halls of Valor was kind of released, a lot of people had the question, like, why Halls of Valor? And then the question arose, was Halls of Valor a mistake? In the most recent PTR build, we had the opportunity to be able to test Mythic Plus version of Halls of Valor and kind of seeing like what is the same about the dungeon and what is different. And I feel like this is a great time to talk about and like give feedback about the dungeon and give my general thoughts on what I thought just in general about HOV returning. So first and foremost, Halls of Valor is it's not a lot different, but there are a decent amount of subtle differences in this dungeon that. So the dungeon is the same in the sense of like the mobs are named the same mechanically. They do very similar things, and it definitely feels like Halls of Valor. Now, they removed in large part a lot of the really annoying stuff that made HOV like particularly frustrating. For one, trash count got changed. You actually have to kill more count, but in general, the count on the mobs themselves got adjusted, and the whole W route is very different in this new version of Halls than it was previously. In addition to that, they changed, for some mobs, the cast sequencing of these mobs. Actually, for Heimdall, they changed the amount of times he casts Horn of Valor. He casts Horn of Valor about half as often as he used to. For a decent amount of mobs, like you can see these Thunder Colors here, they changed like a significant amount of like what they do to players. Particularly the stun from the Thunder Callers, the kick that the Thunderous Bolt, or not the Thunderous Bolt, but the stun from the Thunder Callers that used to be like an 8-second stun and like almost 100 to 0 you, now does a lot less just generally to players, and you're still encouraged to kick it, but it's not something that like if you let it go off, it is of utmost importance. Now, there are some parts of Halls of Valor that I've noticed are a little bit more difficult. Particularly the champions have, or there's an ability called Rending Strike, and it puts a bleed on your tank. I've noticed almost immediately that bleed hits incredibly hard. And so that's something that like, there are still aspects of the dungeon where, okay, you can tell why players would used to kite this dungeon, and it definitely feels in some ways like it's a really old dungeon in that regard. But in general, they have livened up and freshened up the count. The count in the dungeon, the whole W route's a lot better. I think that the problem mobs have largely been fixed. There was also a trash pack in front of Herja that just in general didn't give count. They changed that to where that pack now gives count, and so you are able to pull it or continue to skip it. And in addition to that, Halls of Valor, like, I mean, you can see right here, we let a cast go off, so we're gonna have to like full wipe. If you make mistakes and you're pulling really big, you still absolutely can get punished for it. So they didn't make the dungeon free or anything. Now, I will say, I think that one of the most interesting things that they did to this dungeon is maybe one of the reasons that you would say that they shouldn't have brought back this dungeon is because of the 45-minute timer. That actually got changed. Now this dungeon's on a 38-minute timer. And I think one of the big things that maybe is a little bit overlooked with this dungeon being as long as it is generally is that it's coupled with Court of Stars, which is a 30-minute timer. Temple of the Jade Serpent, if that's not a 30-minute timer, I'm going to be stunned. Ruby Life Pools is 30 minutes. Algathar Academy is 30 minutes. And Azure Vaults is 30 minutes. And so it's coupled with what we've seen, 5 dungeons that have already been shown at, or probably are going to be at a 30-minute timer. And so having something that is 38, and then maybe if it's too short, potentially bumping it up to like 40, seems like it might be well within line. I'm not surprised that they did in fact nerf the timer in this key. In addition to that, something that they did do is they also tuned and adjusted most of the bosses, just generally. And so it's something that like there are still some major issues with this dungeon. But I think that Blizzard has at least done a good job of justifying bringing back Halls of Valor. Now, I'm not going to really speak on the fact that like some people have the belief that they should not brought back legacy dungeons at all. They should have gotten all the Dragonflight dungeons. That's not necessarily within the scope of the video. But I do think that Blizzard has done a good job, at least in Halls of Valor's perspective, of livening up the key and making it more approachable with modern M+ in mind. And that's kind of the general thought, is like this dungeon feels is strangely more modern in a way than even some of the keys that we've had and we've actually been showcased even in Dragonflight, where in the sense of like in this big hallway area, you're able to like, if I can skip forward far enough, you're able to actually skip some of the trash, and you can kind of self-select the packs that you're going to be pulling. Whereas like the whole W route, I mean, it's going to give you 100% trash count, and so there's a decent amount of trash. I bet if you routed the whole entire thing in MDT, you'd probably get somewhere close to 220% enemy forces. But like at the same point, you don't have to pull everything. Like look at this pack. We could have just walked by this pack. We didn't have to pull it. Now, some of the downsides of the dungeon, a lot of walking, an incredible amount of walking. It's still pretty problematic. I'm not really sure what the remedy is to this. Maybe after the first boss dies, you could get like a speed buff. That could be one way of helping alleviate it a little bit. Obviously, after you kill the third boss of the dungeon, you get like a massive speed boost, but that's not until you kill the third boss of the dungeon. Even still, after that, you're running for 45 seconds. You have to start there's a bunch of RP in this dungeon, which on that end, I talked about how it feels modern in some ways. On that way, it definitely feels worse, where it's like, okay, I don't like the amount of RP that is in this dungeon. In addition to that, they've actually changed up some stuff. There's no cast time on Arcing Bolt and Expel Light on Herja anymore. So there used to be, and it was one of those things where I was actually really surprised whenever I noticed that they had removed the cast time on the Arcing Bolt and the Expel Light. And so I'm not really sure what the deal is with that. That boss in particular, if I'm going to give some feedback on it, I feel like that boss is problematic and maybe should be looking at to also be reworked. Just fundamentally how that fight works, it's always setting you up to where either the mechanics aren't going to do anything, or you're gridlocked into something where you're going to potentially get one shot. In addition to that, I feel like the Fenrir AoE soak should potentially also have a cast time. The fact that it doesn't right now, it could be one of those things that's alleviated with timers, but at the same point, the fact that this Fenrir AoE soak doesn't have a cast time makes it kind of difficult to telegraph in some areas. There was also some other stuff like Thundering, the Thundering seasonal affix got covered by Odin's marks, that kind of stuff. Obviously, you're going to run into issues with that. It's just early in the beta cycle. So let's talk about overall, just generally what my thoughts are. And was Halls of Valor a mistake? I am going to go out on a limb and say I think that they've actually done a really good job with HOV just in general, refurbing it and making it a dungeon that is exciting to play, at least even though it is the second time we've seen the dungeon. So in that aspect, it was a mistake? No. I actually don't think it was a mistake, and I think that a lot of the time and effort that has been put into refurbishing this dungeon has me, at least even on from my perspective, more excited to see what they have done with potentially like Court of Stars, Temple of the Jade Serpent, and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds. Now, does this mean that it's going to be... Now, is everybody going to share this opinion? Probably not. But I think that just a lot of the stuff that they did, they've removed mobs in a lot of sections as well. So like a bunch of those big hallway area packs, they're not the same. Some of the top of the stairs packs, they're just not the same at all. And a lot of those things are just not as they were back in Legion, because Blizzard knows that the player base is different now. They're looking for a different thing. And I think that one of the things they did in Season 4 is they just copied and pasted the Legion and BFA variations of Junkyard and Karazhan and the Karazhans into Season 4. And I thought that that was a mistake, and that they should be looking to refurb them and kind of change them up in some different ways. Blizzard has done that. They've kind of kept the feel of the dungeon. Halls of Valor is a beautiful dungeon, one of the prettiest dungeons I've ever seen. But at the same point, like I do think that there are still some issues with HOV, but in the aspect of like, okay, if you're presented with the prompt, okay, we're going to pick a dungeon, I would not have picked HOV as a top priority, but I'm glad that they picked Halls of Valor, and I think they did a good job. I'm interested to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. Ignore the fact that we look like we may be wiping. We actually kill this boss. Our tank is able to solo it. Shout out Vengeance Demon Hunters. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video, and we're out of here.